Not all heroes wear medals. Some quietly live in old buses, forgotten by the world. This is the story of a man left behind, and the little girl who chose to see him. It's about courage, loss, and how one simple act of kindness can change everything. If stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. There are still many hidden heroes waiting to be heard. Asterisk at the edge of Denver's growing sprawl, just beyond where the traffic lights fade into prairie, dust and long-forgotten lots, sat an old, rusted-out city bus. No number on the side, no route on the front. The paint was flaking off in layers, like shedding skin, and weeds had grown up around its wheels, as if the earth itself was trying to take it back. Most people didn't look at it twice. To the commuters speeding down the nearby highway, to the parents dropping off kids at the soccer fields, to the teens skateboarding near the corner gas station, it was just a piece of junk. Another relic no one bothered to move. Another thing ignored. But every evening, as the sky turned that deep bruised purple shade that only Colorado sunsets seemed to know, a faint light would flicker from within. Dim, orange, like a candle caught behind frosted glass. If you were standing close enough, and hardly anyone ever was, you might see the shadow of a man shift inside. Just a figure, slow and still, as if time moved differently in there. His name was Walter. No last name given. No one ever asked. He was just the old man in the bus. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't beg, didn't shout. Just appeared and disappeared with the daylight, as if carried on the wind. He always wore the same thing, a faded green coat with missing buttons, a thick pair of worn-out boots, and a military-style cap that had long lost its shape and color. It slouched on his head like it too had seen too much. No one knew how long he'd been living there. Some said a few months. Others swore it had been years. A handful of locals figured he must be ex-military. He had that look, the kind of posture that used to be straight, a kind of stillness that only came from training or trauma, or both. But mostly, people didn't talk about him at all. Just another homeless man. Just another situation. He became part of the background. There was a rhythm to the neighborhood. Trash trucks came Monday mornings. A taco truck parked by the auto shop at noon. The gas station clerk changed shifts at 4 p.m. sharp. And in the distance, as dusk crept in, Walter would emerge from the bus and sit on an old folding chair just outside the door like clockwork. He didn't smoke, didn't drink. He'd just sit there, knees apart, hands folded, staring out toward nothing in particular. Sometimes he'd tap lightly on the rim of the front tire with his fingers, like a slow drumbeat, like he was keeping time with a memory no one else could hear. Other times, he'd hum, quiet, off-key, the kind of hum that wraps around silence like a blanket, gentle and broken. People learned to walk around him, not because he was scary, not because he was angry, but because he was invisible. And yet, every now and then, someone would feel his eyes on them. Not in a creepy way, no, not at all. Just present, observing, like he was taking in every movement of the world, even as it forgot he was there. His gaze was sharp, the kind that felt like it used to matter, the kind that used to command attention in a room or on a battlefield. No one ever asked him where he came from. No one ever asked if he was hungry. No one ever wondered what his story was. Because deep down, maybe they were scared of the answer. What if it was sad? What if it was too real? What if it made them feel something they weren't ready to carry? And so, Walter remained a ghost in plain sight. The inside of the bus was a different world. Old sheets hung from the ceiling to partition off sections. A worn-out cot sat in the back near what used to be the emergency exit. Crates and boxes were stacked neatly along the windows, each one labeled in sharp, disciplined handwriting, tools, food, medical, memories. There was no clutter, no garbage, no chaos. Everything had its place, just like it might have in a barracks long ago. Above the cot, taped carefully to the wall, was a photo, faded and yellowing. It showed a younger man in full military gear, standing beside a helicopter with smoke rising in the background. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his eyes. Fire, focus, a sense of purpose. That man had been someone. Across from the photo, a small tin stove glowed gently each night. Walter used it to boil water, make tea, heat up beans. He never used more than he needed, never wasted a thing. He read by candlelight mostly old war novels and military histories that had been rescued from donation bins. Sometimes he'd trace his finger over the words, like he was feeling the past as much as reading it. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't violent. He wasn't addicted. He was just alone. And in a world that moves fast and forgets faster, that might be the most unbearable thing of all. Every now and then, the bus would get tagged by teens with nothing better to do. Spray paint over the windows. Crude jokes on the side. Each time, Walter would rise early, pull out a wire brush and a jug of water, and scrub it off. Not angrily, not hastily, just patiently, like someone cleaning a grave. A few times, local volunteers passed by to offer shelter referrals or food vouchers. Walter would take them politely, but never use them. "I'm all right," he'd say, the only words most people ever heard from him. Always followed by a nod. Always with the same soft, worn-out smile that somehow said, "Please don't worry. But thank you for trying." The truth was no one really knew how much he was carrying. No one knew what he'd seen. No one knew what kept him tapping on that tire, night after night, as if trying to remember a rhythm only he could feel. To the world, he was just a broken man on a forgotten bus. But inside that bus was a life, a history. A man with a name that used to mean something, and the only reason anyone would ever come to know it was because one day, a little girl with a cookie in her hand and warmth in her heart would choose to stop and ask, "Is he cold, Mom?" The wind had a bite to it that afternoon. It wasn't quite a blizzard, but it had that sharp winter edge that made people pull their coats tighter and walk a little faster. The sky above Denver hung low, dull gray, like a worn-out wool blanket that had lost its warmth. Cars lined up outside the nearby grocery store, their breaths steaming in the cold. A few crows picked through trash near the parking lot, cawing lazily. Down the sidewalk, a woman walked hand in hand with her daughter, their steps crunching against the bits of frozen gravel. The woman's name was Rachel, and the girl skipping beside her in thick pink boots and a puffed-up jacket with unicorns all over it. Her name was Emma. 10 years old, full of questions, full of energy, full of things adults forget to feel after a while. Emma carried a small, slightly dented cookie tin in her arms, pressed to her coat. The lid was covered with glitter stickers, and one of the unicorn eyes had rubbed off. Inside were about a dozen cookies. Sugar cookies, a little burned at the edges, but full of care. She had made them herself mostly. Her mom had helped with the oven part. "Do you think people will like them?" Emma asked, looking up with the kind of hopeful worry that only a kid can manage. "Of course they will," Rachel smiled. "You worked hard on them. That always makes things taste better." They were on their way to visit Rachel's sister, who had just had a baby. The cookies were Emma's gift. But as they turned the corner near the old auto shop, Emma stopped mid-step. "Mom? Look." Rachel followed her daughter's gaze. There. It was the same rusted bus that everyone in the neighborhood pretended not to see. The same one she had told Emma not to worry about weeks ago. And just like always, the same man sat beside it. Walter, wrapped in his old coat, hat tilted low, hands folded in his lap like always. He wasn't moving much, but his eyes were open, watching the wind push a crumpled paper cup across the lot. Emma stared. Not scared, just curious. Curious in that way that only kids are before the world teaches them to look away. Why does he sit there all the time? She asked. Rachel hesitated. That's just where he lives, sweetie. In that bus? Yes. But it's so cold today. Rachel sighed. I know. Emma paused again, looked down at the cookie tin in her arms, then back up. Do you think he's hungry? I'm sure he could use something warm. And without waiting for permission, Emma did something that no one else in that town had done in years, maybe ever. She stepped off the sidewalk and walked straight toward Walter. Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but stopped. There was something about the way Emma walked, determined but gentle, careful but without fear. A child's kindness unfiltered by adult hesitation. Walter didn't move at first. He saw her coming, of course he did. He always saw. But he didn't speak. Just watched. Emma stopped a few feet away, unsure of the rules of, well, whatever this was. Giving something to a stranger. Approaching someone everyone else avoided. Hi, she said finally. Walter blinked, slowly, then gave her a nod. The same small, respectful nod he gave every squirrel, shadow, or passerby who looked his way. I made these, Emma said, lifting the cookie tin like an offering. Would you like one? She opened the lid and held it out with both hands. The cookies jostled slightly. A few had smudged icing or cracked edges. But they were cookies all the same. Walter stared, long enough for Emma to wonder if she'd done something wrong. Then, slowly, very slowly, he lifted a gloved hand and reached inside. He picked the smallest cookie, as if trying not to be greedy. Thank you, he said, voice hoarse like a whisper dragged across gravel. Haven't had one of these in a long time. Emma smiled wide. They're not perfect. They're perfect enough, he said, and took a bite. For a moment, the world around them softened. The wind still blew, but it didn't feel as sharp. The crows stopped squawking. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and was ignored. And there, beside a bus no one cared about, a girl and a man shared something real. Emma didn't leave right away. She stood there, watching Walter chew, watching his eyes soften, just barely, watching the way he held the cookie like it was something sacred. What's your name? She asked. He chewed slowly, swallowed, then wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his sleeve. Walter, he said. I'm Emma, she replied proudly. I'm 10. He gave her a quiet chuckle. It sounded like something old creaking open. Well, Miss Emma, you made my day, she beamed. I'm glad. From the sidewalk, Rachel watched silently, hand over her chest, something stinging behind her eyes. She hadn't seen Walter smile, not once. But there he was smiling at her daughter, like she was the first ray of sun to touch his skin in decades. Emma finally turned to go. But before she left, she reached into the tin again and pulled out one more cookie. You can have 2, she said with a wink. I made a lot. Walter laughed again, and nodded in gratitude. Emma skipped back to her mother. Her hands were cold now, but her heart was warm. What did he say? Rachel asked as they walked. That his name's Walter, and that I made his day? Rachel put her arm around Emma and squeezed gently. You probably did more than that. Behind them, Walter watched the girl disappear down the block. He looked down at the second cookie in his hand, then slowly back at the bus. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't go back inside right away. Instead, he stood outside a little longer, looking at the spot where Emma had stood. The small set of footprints left behind in the frost. He placed the second cookie gently on top of the folded chair. Then he reached under the cot inside the bus, pulled out a small metal box, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a newspaper, old, yellowed, folded carefully. On the front page, a picture of a younger Walter in uniform. Behind him, a helicopter smoldered. The headline read, "War Hero Saves 11 Soldiers from Ambush in Cambodia." He stared at it for a long time, then at the Silver Star medal tucked beneath it, then at the second cookie sitting quietly on the chair outside. He hadn't spoken to a child in decades. And yet, in just a few moments, that little girl had reminded him that he was still here. That maybe he still mattered. Maybe kindness wasn't just a memory. Maybe hope could still taste like sugar and warmth, and a little bit of burnt edges. Maybe tomorrow, when the sun set again, he'd hope to see her walking down the block. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. Not yet. That night, the cold felt sharper than usual. The Denver wind had crept under the seams of Walter's old coat, slipping through the fabric like fingers, trying to remind him he was still alive. He was used to it. The ache in his joints, the slow burning chill that settled into his bones. It had become part of his life, like the bus or the silence. But tonight, something was different. He sat in the bus, alone as always. But this time, he wasn't humming. He wasn't tapping on the rim of the wheel. He just sat there, staring at the second cookie Emma had left him. It sat on the little wooden crate he used as a makeshift table, next to an old tin mug of lukewarm tea, untouched, like an offering, like a memory. Walter leaned back against the frame of the window and closed his eyes. But instead of sleep, images came. A jungle, screaming. The sound of rotor blades thundering above. Smoke thick in his throat. Heat so heavy it made the air shimmer. And voices, so many voices calling for help, calling for him. He opened his eyes slowly, exhaled, and reached down beneath the cot. There, tucked beneath 2 layers of folded tarp, was a battered green metal case. The paint was chipped, the latch slightly bent, but it still opened with a soft click that echoed far too loud in the quiet space. Inside were things no one had seen in decades. Things Walter hadn't touched in years, not since he'd first parked the bus in this lot and decided he didn't want to be found anymore. He stared at the contents for a moment. Then, with slow, deliberate hands, he pulled out a folded newspaper, yellowed, soft with age, and creased from being read and reread 100 times. He laid it on his lap and carefully smoothed it out. On the front page was a black and white photo. A young man barely 24, sharp-eyed, lean, standing in front of a smoking UH-1 Huey helicopter. His face was streaked with sweat and ash, a cut running down his cheek. His uniform was wrinkled, his helmet missing, his boots caked in mud, but he was alive, standing tall. The only thing still upright in the wreckage behind him. The headline read, "Staff Sergeant Walter Kane saves 11 soldiers from firefight in Cambodian highlands." Walter stared at the image, at his younger self. His hand trembled slightly as he traced a finger across the paper. He remembered that day with painful clarity. It had been an ambush. A bad one. They were flying in supplies routine run, low risk. Until the first rocket hit. Then the second. The pilot went down fast, and so did they. Half the men were already injured when they hit the ground. And Walter, well, Walter didn't think. He just moved. He pulled one man out, then another, then another. Machine gun fire all around. Screams, blood, the acrid stench of burning, fuel. He should have died that day. But he did single quotes T.11 others. Didn't either because of him. The article had called him a hero, a symbol of courage. A shining example of what the American soldier stood for. They gave him a silver star, a handshake from a general, a letter from the White House. For a week, his photo was everywhere: local news, base newsletters, even a small segment on the evening broadcast. Then, the cameras left. And the nightmares stayed. Walter reached into the metal case again and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay the silver star, tarnished, a few scratches on the surface, but still gleaming faintly under the dim glow of the bus's interior light. He held it in his hand and stared. He hadn't looked at it in over 10 years. It wasn't that he was ashamed of it. No, he had earned it. But medals don't stop the dreams. They don't hug you when your buddy doesn't make it home. They don't silence the sounds that never quite leave your ears. Gunfire in the distance. A name shouted through smoke. The whisper of a last breath. Walter's eyes grew glassy, but no tears fell. He was too tired for crying now. Too worn out. But his heart ached, aching with the weight of stories that had never been told. Wounds that never had words. He picked up the old photo from beneath the newspaper. It showed him and his unit, lined up in front of their chopper months before the ambush. All of them grinning, dirty, arms slung around each other like brothers. Young, so damn young. He ran a finger down the line of faces. Mendoza, Jacobs, Webb. He paused at the last two. Rex. He smiled softly. Rex had been his military dog. German shepherd, trained like a machine, loyal like no human could ever be. Rex had saved his life twice. Once by sniffing out a tripwire. Once by jumping between Walter and a bullet. He swallowed hard. I should have brought you home, boy. He folded the newspaper gently and placed it back in the case, along with the medal and photo. Then closed the lid and slid it under the cot again. But something had shifted. Something small. The tin cookie still sat on the crate beside him. And now Walter reached for it. He took a bite. It crumbled slightly in his hand, sweet and messy. He chewed slowly, eyes closed. It tasted like butter, too much sugar, and maybe a little cinnamon. It tasted like care. Like someone had made something for someone else. That little girl, Emma. She didn't know his past. She didn't know what he'd done, what he'd lost, or what ghosts he carried with him through every night. She had just seen a man sitting in the cold, and she had offered him kindness. No questions, no pity, just a cookie and a smile. Walter looked toward the frosted window. For years, he had convinced himself he was better off alone. That people didn't need to know who he was, or what he had once been. That the world didn't have space for broken men in rusted buses. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe people just needed a reason to look again. And maybe that reason had pink boots and a cookie tin. He chuckled softly at the thought. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so invisible. He looked down at the empty cookie wrapper and smiled. Thanks, kid, he whispered. Then, slowly, he reached for a pen. And for the first time in years, Walter Kane began to write. Not a journal, not a letter. To the past, just a few words on the back of an old receipt. Her name was Emma. She gave me a cookie. I remembered who I was. He folded it and tucked it next to the newspaper under the cot. Outside, the wind kept howling through the lot. But inside the bus, something had changed. Not everything. Not yet, but something. The Sunday after the cookie, the sky cleared. The sun peeked shyly through winter clouds, casting long golden rays across the cold concrete. It was still freezing, but there was a lightness in the air, like the wind had finally exhaled. Walter sat on his usual folding chair beside the bus, sipping tea from a dented tin mug. His breath came out in white clouds. A scarf wrapped around his neck, one someone had left anonymously weeks ago, was tucked carefully into his coat. His cap sat a little straighter than usual. And he was waiting. He didn't know why. A he. Was something inside him, deep and soft like a drumbeat under layers of noise, told him she might come back. And then she did. Around the corner came Emma, bundled up in her unicorn coat again, her cheeks rosy from the cold, and her feet moving with that joyful half-skip only children know how to do. But this time, she wasn't empty-handed. She carried a small, round box, light blue, with silver ribbon wrapped around the top like a gift. Her mother walked behind her, slower this time, hands in her pockets. Watching. Walter sat up a little straighter. "Hi, Mr. Walter," Emma beamed. He couldn't help it. He smiled back, that quiet, almost forgotten smile that hadn't seen daylight in too many years. "Well, hey there, Miss Emma. I brought you something," she said, holding up the box like a trophy. "It's my birthday today. I turned 11. But I saved you a piece of cake." Walter blinked. She walked right up to him and handed him the box. He opened it slowly, his fingers clumsy but careful. Inside, nestled in a napkin, was a slice of chocolate cake with pink frosting and rainbow sprinkles on top. "I asked Mom to save you one before the party," Emma said proudly, "because I thought birthdays are for sharing." Walter stared at the cake. Something caught in his throat. "Well," he said softly, "I don't think I've had birthday cake in, what, 20 years? 30? He chuckled. "This might be a record breaker." Emma giggled. "You should eat it before it melts. I kept it warm inside my coat." He took a bite, slow and deliberate. It was sweet, too sweet. The icing was sticky, the cake a little crumbly, and it was perfect. "You got yourself a talent," he said, licking frosting from the corner of his lip. "You and that cookie could open a bakery one day." Emma glowed. Then, after a moment, she sat down cross-legged on the pavement in front of him. "Can I ask you something?" Walter nodded. "Sure. Were you really in the army?" He paused, looked down, looked back up. Double quotes. "Yes, I was." Emma's eyes widened. "Like, in a war?" He nodded again, slower this time. "Vietnam. A long, long time ago." Emma thought for a moment, fiddling with the end of her mitten. Was it scary? Walter took a breath, looked out at the street, past the gas station, past the trees with bare branches scratching the sky. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes it was." "Did you have a dog?" Walter turned back to her, eyebrows raised. "A dog?" "Yeah," she said. "You look like someone who would have a dog. Soldiers always have dogs in movies." Walter chuckled, deep and quiet. "Well, yeah, I did. His name was Rex." Emma's face lit up. "I knew it." Walter looked away for a second, then back at her. "Would you like to hear about him?" "Yes," she said, practically bouncing. "Please." So Walter told her. He told her about Rex, a German shepherd, smart as a whip, trained to sniff out explosives and sense danger before it came. He told her how Rex used to ride in the helicopter beside him, ears up, eyes sharp, tongue flopping in the wind. How Rex would stand guard at night while the others slept. He was like our sixth sense, Walter said, his voice softer now. He always knew, before any of us did. Emma listened without blinking. Walter continued. He told her about the day everything went wrong, the ambush, the chaos, the sound of gunfire echoing through the jungle like thunder. How they were trying to pull wounded soldiers out of the crash site, one after another, and how Rex ran straight into the line of fire to distract the enemy, giving Walter just enough time to drag the last man to cover. He didn't make it, Walter said, his voice tight, but I did. And so did the others, because of him. Emma looked down at the pavement. Was he scared? She asked quietly. Walter thought for a moment. Maybe, but he didn't stop. That's what courage is, I think. Doing the right thing even when you're scared. Emma was silent for a while. Then she said, I think Rex was a hero. Walter smiled sadly. He was. There was a pause. The wind rustled the dead leaves nearby. A bird flew overhead. Then Emma asked, Do you ever think he knows you remember? Him? Walter blinked. That question hung in the air, heavier than all the others. He looked at Emma, at her wide, honest eyes, filled not with pity, but with care. With the kind of belief adults forget how to hold. I hope so, he whispered. I really do. Emma reached into her coat and pulled out a crayon drawing on wrinkled paper. It showed a dog with a big smile, a soldier beside him, both under a rainbow. At the top it said, Rex, the hero dog. I made this last night, she said. It's not perfect, but I thought you might like it. Walter took the paper in both hands, carefully, reverently, like it was something sacred. Emma, he said, voice cracking for the first time. This means more than you know. She smiled. You can keep it. Walter nodded, blinking fast. For a long moment, they sat there, old and young, soldier and child, pain and light. A man remembering who he used to be, and a girl reminding him that it still mattered. Rachel, standing a few feet away, had tears in her eyes. Emma stood up, dusted her knees. I gotta go now. But I'll be back next Sunday, okay? Walter nodded. I'll be right here. She waved. Bye, Mr. Walter. Bye, Miss Emma. She skipped off again, arms swinging, coat flapping behind her. Walter watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he looked down at the drawing. Again, and for the first time in decades, Walter Kane took a piece of tape and stuck something on the inside wall of the bus. Right next to his old army photo, now hung a crayon drawing of Rex under a rainbow. Hero remembered. By a little girl with pink boots and a heart big enough to reach back through time. It started with a whisper, just a single comment in a 5th grade classroom, spoken without fanfare, tucked between a spelling quiz and recess. Did you know there's a real war hero living in a bus behind the gas station? Ms. Caldwell, who had taught at the elementary school for over 2 decades, paused mid-sentence. She was the kind of teacher who wore cat print scarves and always kept a mug of chamomile tea on her desk. She had heard her students say all sorts of stories about invisible dragons, haunted microwaves, or their dog being the mayor of the backyard. But this one made her blink. She turned toward the speaker, Emma. Her tone wasn't boastful. It wasn't wild or silly. It was calm, confident, true. He has a medal, Emma said, and a picture of a helicopter. He told me about his dog. His name was Rex. Miss Caldwell set down her whiteboard marker. That afternoon, when the final bell rang and backpacks shuffled down crowded hallways, Miss Caldwell stayed behind. She sat at her desk long after the noise faded, sipping her lukewarm tea and staring out the window at the trees shaking in the wind. She had driven past that old bus 100 times, never looked twice. That night, curiosity pulled at her like a thread. She didn't go alone. She brought a small tin of oatmeal raisin cookies and wore a soft blue sweater, one she thought looked welcoming. As she pulled into the empty lot where the rusted bus sat, her car headlights caught the shape of a man sitting beside it, his shadow long against the pavement. She parked slowly, stepped out, and approached with cautious warmth. Walter noticed her immediately. Of course he did. He always noticed. Evenin', he said with a small nod. Miss Caldwell offered a smile. Evening. I hope I'm not intruding. Walter raised an eyebrow. You're the first adult who's come by in quite a while. So I'd say you're more of a surprise than an intrusion. She chuckled gently. That's fair. I'm Emma's teacher. She told me about you. And about Rex. Walter's eyes softened. Ah, that little whirlwind with the unicorn jacket. She has a good heart. She does. There was a pause. Wind swept between them like a whisper. Miss Caldwell extended the cookie tin. I brought these. I don't know if you like raisins. Walter took the tin carefully. I've eaten bugs before. Raisins sound delightful. She laughed, surprised at his dry humor. They sat down, he on his usual folding chair, she on a plastic crate he offered from beside the bus. And he talked. Not everything, but enough for her to understand that this man had lived lives plural, that he had been shaped by moments no human should carry alone, that his silence wasn't empty. It was full, packed tight with things the world didn't want to hear. He showed her the photo, the newspaper, the medal. He didn't need to prove anything, but he did, because part of him, some fragile part, he never admitted, wanted someone to know. When Miss Caldwell left an hour later, her heart was pounding. She had come out of curiosity. She left with purpose. 2 days later, an email landed in the inbox of the local news station. The subject line read, "There's a Silver Star hero living in a bus. You need to hear his story." The station almost ignored it. They got dozens of random tips every day. Lost dogs, UFO sightings, ghosts and microwaves. But one intern, Anna, was a former journalism student who had studied war correspondence. The word Silver Star caught her attention like a spark in dry grass. She clicked, read, reread. Then she picked up the phone. The knock on the side of the bus came. Early Saturday morning. Walter was already awake. He always was. He'd lived too long with soldiers' habits up before the sun, alert before the noise. He opened the door slowly, unsure of what to expect. 2 people stood there. One with a camera. The other, a young woman in a dark coat with a notebook clutched to her chest. "Mr. Walter Kane?" she asked, almost hesitant. He narrowed his eyes. "Depends who's asking." "My name's Anna, sir. I work with Channel 9. We heard about you from a teacher, from a little girl named Emma. We'd like to hear your story. Share it, if that's okay." Walter stood in the doorway, eyes scanning hers. He had been interviewed before, 40 years ago. A lifetime ago. And he'd sworn he'd never do it again. But some part of him, not yet buried, looked past the camera and saw something different. Not exploitation, not pity. Just someone asking. And so, for the first time in 4 decades, Walter Kane stepped out into the sunlight, straightened his coat, and sat down in front of a lens. The interview wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. He spoke slowly, carefully. He talked about the jungle, the mission, the crash, the men. He talked about Rex. He talked about the quiet that comes after the war, the kind of silence you can't train for, the way the world moves on without you, and how easy it is to disappear. He didn't call himself a hero. In fact, he said the opposite. "I'm not a hero," he said, looking directly into the lens. "I just survived. That's all. The heroes, they didn't make it back." The anchor tried to ask about his medals. The letter from President Reagan. The ceremony. But Walter only shook his head. "Paper and ribbons don't keep you warm at night. Memories do. People do. And sometimes. Cookie from a little girl." The anchor blinked. "A cookie?" Walter smiled, soft and sincere. Changed everything. The segment aired the following evening. It was only 6 minutes long, but 6 minutes was enough. By morning, the station's inbox had over 400 messages. People asking how to help, how to find him. Veterans reaching out. A local bakery offered free meals. A hardware store offered to repair the bus. A high school ROTC group asked if they could meet him. Shake his hand. And outside Walter's bus, people began to show up. Not in a crowd, not like tourists. But in small, gentle waves. A young man left a folded American flag with a note, "For your brothers." A woman brought a bouquet of sunflowers. My father served too. I never got to say thank you. A boy from the neighborhood dropped off his Cub Scout badge with trembling hands. "You're the bravest person I know." Walter watched, stunned, as a community that had walked past him for years suddenly leaned in, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. They hadn't seen him before, but now they couldn't unsee him. One afternoon, just before the sun dipped, lo, Emma returned. This time she had nothing in her hands, no cookie, no cake, no drawing. Just herself. She walked up, sat beside Walter, and looked around at the flowers, the cards, the folded flags. "They all came for you," she said. Walter shook his head. "No, they came for the story, for the memories. I'm just the last man holding the photo." Emma smiled gently. "You're more than that." He looked down at her, this little girl who saw through rust and silence and 30 years of pain. "You started this," he said. Emma looked proud. "You deserved it." Walter looked at the small crayon drawing still taped inside the bus. He looked at the sky, now painted gold and orange, with the fading sun. Then he whispered, mostly to himself, "I guess it's never too late to be seen." It was supposed to be just another interview. That's how the producer described it. "We'll do a short follow-up piece, so the community support, maybe talk about the local donations. Keep it light." Walter had agreed, somewhat reluctantly. Not for the cameras, but for the people who had shown up in the days since his story aired. For the boy who gave his scout badge. For the single mom who said, "I watched my dad cry for the first time last night because of you." So he buttoned up his coat, tucked his crayon drawing of Rex into the side of the bus where he could see it, and sat back down in front of the camera crew. The sun was softer now, and the wind had settled into a quiet hush. A gentle peace blanketed the lot. The anchor asked him about the letters that had poured in. Walter smiled. "I never expected people to remember someone they never knew. They asked about the offers. Free housing, medical care, even a nonprofit. Wanting to name a veteran outreach program after him." Walter only shrugged. "All that's nice, sure. But the most important thing I've gotten this week was a birthday cake and a drawing of a dog." Everyone laughed gently. The interview was winding down. A good story, clean and clear. The type of segment that wraps up with applause and maybe a slow pan to the sky. But then, a car pulled into the lot. Not a news van, not a curious stranger. Just a plain beige sedan, faded, tired, like it had lived through just enough years to be overlooked. Walter glanced over and froze. The camera crew kept rolling. The anchor didn't notice at first, but Walter's expression changed. His fingers clenched slightly around the edge of his folding chair. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something deeper. Older. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. He was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. Hair mostly gone, slumped shoulders, a limp in his left leg. He wore a jacket 2 sizes too big and a ball cap with U.S. Army vet embroidered across the front. He stopped a few feet from Walter, took off the hat, held it in both hands like a confession. "Walter Kane," the man said, voice shaking. The camera turned. The crew went silent. Even the wind paused. Walter stared. His lips parted but made no sound. The man stepped forward. "It's me, James." Walter didn't move. James's eyes welled up. "I saw you on the news," he said, voice cracking. "I never thought I'd see you again." Silence. Then Walter exhaled, slow and long. The kind of breath that's been waiting for decades to leave the body. James stepped closer, tears running freely now. "I thought you were dead," he said. "For years. And when I saw that broadcast, I almost didn't come. I didn't think I had the right." Walter blinked. James dropped to his knees, right there on the pavement, beside the bus, in front of everyone. "I left you behind." He. Saeed. "That day, when we were ambushed, I broke formation. I ran. I thought I was gonna die. And when I looked back and saw you going toward the fire, pulling guys out, I froze. I just froze." The words spilled out like rain from a long broken cloud. "I've lived with that shame for 40 years, James whispered. "I wake up thinking about it. I go to sleep thinking about it. I see your face every time I try to forget." Walter swallowed hard. The camera was still rolling. A silent crowd had gathered near the edge of the lot, passers-by, neighbors, veterans, all holding their breath. James lowered his head. "If you never want to speak to me again, I understand." He waited. Still. Then Walter leaned forward. He didn't speak right away. His jaw tensed. His eyes shimmered. Then he said, "I wasn't angry." James looked up, confused. "I was heartbroken," Walter continued. "Not because you ran, but because we lost Webb, Mendoza, Rex, and I didn't know if I could ever carry all of that." James's face crumbled. Walter took a deep breath. "But I never hated you. I knew what that moment did to us. All of us. I just couldn't look at anyone after that without seeing ghosts." James sat back on his heels, trembling. Then, slowly, almost unsure if it was real, Walter reached out his hand. James hesitated, then took it. The two old soldiers, men once bound by war, then divided by pain, clasped hands in front of the bus, on cold concrete, beneath a winter sky. And somewhere in that grasp was forgiveness. Real, wordless, sacred. The crowd didn't clap. No one moved. No one dared interrupt something so quiet and holy. Walter stood, slowly, stiffly, pulling James up with him. They embraced, shoulders shaking, heads bowed, not like old friends, but like survivors. Like brothers finding each other in the ashes. The camera kept rolling, but it didn't matter. This moment wasn't for the screen. It was for them. Later, they sat side by side on the crate and folding chair. A thermos of coffee between them. No more cameras. No more interviews. Just two old men in the soft light of forgiveness. "You know," James said, rubbing his hands together, "I spent my whole life thinking I wasn't worth remembering." Walter stared ahead. "I spent mine trying to forget. Funny how both things break you just the same." James murmured. Walter nodded. Then he said, "Emma would have liked you." James chuckled. "Emma?" Walter smiled, soft. "She's the one who brought me back to life." He told him about the cookie, the birthday cake, the crayon drawing of Rex. James listened, tears returning. "Rex," he whispered. "I still think about him." Walter tapped the side of the bus gently. "He's up there now," he said. "Watching, guarding, probably wagging his tail at how dumb we were for waiting so long." They both laughed, a deep, tired, healing kind of laugh. And the pain, while still present, didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. News of the reunion spread fast. Not because of the broadcast, but because people talked. Neighbors, veterans, students. They shared the story of the man in the bus, and the soldier who came back to say sorry. And people didn't just hear it, they felt it. Because everyone had something they regretted, someone they missed, a phone call they never made, a word they never said. Forgiveness, it turns out, isn't just a gift for the forgiven. It frees the forgiver, too. And Walter? He slept better that night than he had in years. Not because the world was fixed, not because the past had changed, but because, for once, the silence was full of peace instead of ghosts. By the time the city decided to plan the event, Walter had already returned to his quiet routine, or at least something like it. He still sat outside the bus every morning, still sipped tea from his battered tin mug, still wore that worn old cap, now just a bit cleaner, thanks to Emma's mother, who had gently asked, "Would it be all right if I washed it for you?" But now, when Walter sat in his chair, he wasn't alone. Neighbors would stop by with folding chairs of their own. Veterans brought their grandkids to shake his hand. Local kids waved at him from the sidewalk. A group of teens from the high school art club painted a mural on the brick wall behind the lot Rex, in bold color, standing tall beneath a glowing sun, with the words, "Loyalty never dies." And every Sunday, like clockwork, Emma came. She brought stories from school, drawings of birds and planets, and once an entire bag of marshmallows, because she thought heroes deserve s'mores too. Walter would smile, listen, and sometimes, when no one was looking, he'd quietly dab the corners of his eyes. But nothing prepared him for the envelope that arrived one chilly morning in early March. The return address was from City Hall. Inside was a formal invitation, embossed, heavy cardstock. "You are cordially invited to a community recognition ceremony honoring Staff Sergeant Walter Kane, Ret, recipient of the Silver Star, and a lifetime of silent service. Date, March 18th, 4 p.m. Location, Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Park. Guest of honor, U. Walter stared at the card for a long while. His fingers traced the letters, like they might disappear. He didn't know what to feel. Pride? Gratitude? Embarrassment? Maybe all of it. Maybe something else entirely. That evening, he placed the invitation on the crate beside Rex's crayon drawing and lit a single candle. "Looks like we're getting dressed up, buddy," he whispered. The morning of the event was bright and unusually warm for late winter. Birds returned early. Snow melted into streams that trickled along the gutters. It felt like even the sky had cleared its schedule. Walter wore his old uniform. Not a new one. Not a replica. His the same olive green jacket he'd worn the day he got the medal. It still fit barely. Emma's mom had helped him clean and iron it, pressing every crease with care like she was polishing history itself. His cap restored, brushed, and proudly tilted forward completed the look. And on his chest, pinned just above his heart, was the Silver Star. As Walter stepped out of the bus, Emma gasped. "You look like a real general," she said, eyes wide with wonder. Walter laughed. "Just a tired old soldier, sweetheart." Rachel, Emma's mom, smiled softly. "Maybe, but today you're our general." They rode together in her car, Emma holding Walter's hand the entire way, the crayon drawing of Rex folded neatly in his inside pocket. When they pulled into the park, Walter froze. He expected a handful of people, maybe some folding chairs, a podium, a few cameras. But what he saw made his chest tighten. Hundreds of people, rows and rows of folding chairs, flags everywhere, a stage with a banner that read, "Welcome home, Sergeant Kane." The local marching band stood to one side. ROTC cadets lined the walkways, standing at attention. Children waved flags. Reporters stood quietly, not intruding. And in the front row sat veterans, young and old, some in uniform, some in wheelchairs, all wearing the same look. Reverence. Emma tugged his sleeve. "Look, there's a statue." At the edge of the green stood a life-size bronze statue. Walter recognized it instantly. It was him. The young man from the newspaper. Not the version saluting in dress blues. No. It was him now sitting on his folding chair, with Rex by his side, both looking off into the distance. Eyes tired but kind. A small smile on his lips. Beneath the statue read, Walter Kane. He never left his post. Hero. Neighbor. Friend. Walter's knees nearly gave out. Emma grabbed his hand tighter. You okay, Mr. Walter? He looked down at her, then at the crowd. He nodded. I think I finally am. The ceremony began with music, gentle, respectful. The mayor gave a short speech about sacrifice and honor. A general from Fort Carson read excerpts from Walter's service record. The news anchor from the original interview stood up and read letters from veterans across the country, some who had never met Walter but felt like they knew him now. Then came the moment. The MC stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we now ask you to rise as we recognize today's guest of honor. Staff Sergeant Walter Kane, Silver Star recipient, and the reason we are all gathered here today. The crowd stood, all of them, in total silence, and they didn't sit down, Walter. Escorted by Emma on one side, and James, his long-lost friend, on the other, walked slowly toward the stage. Each step felt like a memory. His boots pressed softly into the earth. He reached the podium. The crowd remained standing. Walter stood there for a moment, adjusting the mic, unsure where to begin. He looked out across the sea of faces, some smiling, some crying, some saluting. And then, with a voice that cracked once, but stood steady after, he spoke. I've been invisible for a long time, he began. I don't say that to make anyone feel bad. I chose it. I chose to disappear after I came home, because I didn't know how to be here without the people I left behind. He paused, letting the words settle. I didn't want anyone to clap. For me, I didn't want speeches, or statues, or ceremonies. I just wanted to be forgotten quietly. A hush fell deeper, but then a little girl gave me a cookie. The crowd chuckled gently, and she asked me if I was cold. Walter's voice wavered, and something in me cracked open. He looked down at Emma, who smiled proudly. I remembered what it felt like to be seen, not as a symbol, not as a soldier, but just as a man. He swallowed. So if you're standing here today because you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever felt like your story didn't matter anymore, let me tell you, it does. You matter. Every quiet act of courage, every painful memory you carry matters. The crowd stood in silence, and still, no one sat down. Walter reached into his coat and pulled out the crayon drawing. I carry this with me, he said, voice thick, because this dog saved my life, and this drawing saved it again. A single tear rolled down his cheek, and this little girl gave me back the world. He placed the drawing on the podium, gently, and then, looking to the sky, he whispered, the ones who didn't come home, I never forgot you. And with that, the entire park erupted in applause. But no one sat. They stood for the man who had stood alone for decades. They stood for the soldier who finally came home. They stood. Walter Kane. A week after the ceremony, the old bus stood still in the same parking lot, but it was no longer a forgotten shadow. People passed by and waved. School kids stopped after class to drop off cards, drawings, and sometimes even dog toys for Rex. Of course, a local coffee shop had started a tradition. The Walter Special black coffee with a side of cinnamon cookie. The city had offered Walter a brand new apartment downtown, fully furnished, with all utilities paid by a veteran outreach program. But he turned it down gently. I've slept in a lot of places, he told them. But the bus, that's home. At least for now. He didn't say it with sadness, just with truth. The bus had kept him alive. It had been his bunker, his retreat, his chapel. And though it still creaked in the wind and smelled faintly of oil and old leather, it was sacred to him. Still, The community wasn't about to let their hero spend another winter in a rusted shell. So they built him something else. Behind a row of trees near the edge of a quiet neighborhood, tucked away just enough for peace, but not for isolation, stood a small cottage. White trim, a gray roof, and a porch swing. The home was paid for by donations more than Walter could ever have imagined. When they brought him to see it, he stood there on the porch for a long time, silent. "Is it really for me?" he asked. Emma squeezed his hand. "It's yours, Mr. Walter. No one deserves it more." The house had everything he needed. A simple bedroom, a kitchen that actually worked, a living room with wide windows, and a garden in the back. And on the mantel above the fireplace, someone had already placed the crayon drawing of Rex, framed in polished oak. Next to it was a plaque that read, "For Walter Kane, because some heroes don't ask to be remembered, but we remember them anyway." Walter moved in that weekend. And for the first time in decades, he locked a door behind him, not out of fear, but out of peace. Life didn't become perfect. He still had nights where he woke up in a sweat, heart pounding from sounds that no longer existed. He still sat outside sometimes with that faraway look, as if waiting for someone to walk out of the tree line with muddy boots and a crooked smile. But no, he wasn't alone in those moments. Neighbors stopped by with muffins or blankets, or just to say hi. A retired nurse came every Thursday to check his blood pressure and bring him books. Emma and Rachel visited every Sunday, without fail. Sometimes they brought board games. Other times, just stories. Sometimes they sat together and didn't talk at all, just listened to the birds. And on the first Sunday of April, Emma brought him something new. A box. Inside was a small ceramic sculpture, rough but lovingly painted. It was a dog, sitting proudly with a wagging tail. "It's Rex," she said. "I made it in art class." Walter held the sculpture like it was made of gold. He placed it gently on the windowsill beside his chair. "He would have liked you, you know," he said. Emma smiled. "I hope so." Then she grew quiet for a moment. "Mr. Walter, are you scared of getting old?" Walter chuckled. "Sweetheart, I am old. No, I mean really old, like when it's time to go." He looked at her thoughtfully. "I used to be," he said. "For a long time, I thought I'd go without anyone, noticing that I'd just disappear." He looked out the window, toward the sun spilling over the grass. "But now, I'm not so scared, because I know I was seen. I know I was forgiven, and I know I mattered." Emma didn't fully understand it then, but one day she would. Morning, the porch was quiet. No coffee mug, no tapping on the rail, no newspaper waiting on the step. Rachel noticed first. She knocked, then gently opened the door. Walter was inside, in his chair by the window, with a blanket across his lap. The morning sun touched his face gently. His cap was in his lap. His eyes were closed. And in his hand was a folded note. Rachel called the paramedics, but it was already clear. Walter had passed peacefully in his sleep. The entire town seemed to exhale. At once, news spread fast, but not like a headline. It passed gently, from hand to hand, heart to heart. "Walter Kane is gone." But not really. The funeral was held a week later. It was sunny. Veterans from 5 different states showed up, men and women Walter had served with or inspired. Even James returned, standing tall beside Emma as pallbearers carried Walter's flag-draped casket. A full military honor guard saluted him. 21 guns fired into the sky. A bugle played taps, and there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Emma stood with Rachel, holding tightly to the ceramic Rex, now clutched to her chest like a stuffed animal. The mayor gave a speech. So did the general from Fort Carson. But the last words came from Emma. She stepped up to the podium, her voice small, but steady. Walter wasn't just a soldier. He was my friend. He taught me that heroes don't always look like superheroes. Sometimes they wear old boots and live in buses and carry pain you can't see. She held up the crayon drawing, now laminated and framed. I gave him this. But really, he gave me more than I could ever give back. She paused, eyes brimming with tears. And I hope he's with Rex now. Running, smiling, finally home. Silence. Then applause. Not loud. But full of reverence. Back in the lot. The bus remained, not rusting, not abandoned. It had become a memorial. The city preserved it, cleaned it, put up a plaque at the entrance. Inside, they placed Walter's chair, his mug, his photos, and of course, the drawing of Rex. On the side of the bus, a mural was painted. It showed Walter, standing tall in his uniform, one hand resting on Rex's head. Behind them, light, peace. Above it, in bold white letters. He didn't ask to be remembered, but we always will. As the years passed, Emma grew up. She became a writer. Her first book was titled The Man in the Bus, a true story of cookies, crayons, and quiet courage. She dedicated it to Walter Kane and every invisible hero who just needed someone to ask, "Are you cold?" The book became a bestseller, not because it was flashy, but because it was true. And people are always hungry for truth. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, Emma still walks by the lot. She sits on the bench beside the bus, and she talks to Walter, tells him about her day, tells him about her life, and she always brings 2 cookies, one for her, one for him, just in case. Walter never asked for recognition. But thanks to a child's kindness, his story found light. He left behind more than a medal. He left a message that even the smallest gesture can uncover greatness. If this touched your heart, hit subscribe. Let's keep remembering those the world forgot.